Mechanicalness. It has been noted that a person's work on themselves starts from the moment they begin to feel two people in themselves. One is passive, and the most it can do is to register and observe what is happening to it at the hands of the other. The second, which calls itself I, is active. It speaks of itself in the first person. It regards itself as being the real, the individualism within. Note that it is said that someone's work starts from the moment they begin to feel two people in themselves, one passive and the other active. Now, how many of us do you suppose reach this stage? So let's ask ourselves this question: have any of us reached the stage distinctly, so that we constantly realize that there is an active side in us that will keep on taking charge at every moment, and a passive side that can only look on and be conscious that this is so, but is quite helpless in the face of the active side? If anyone can answer with certainty that they have reached this stage, then it is a matter for celebration, because it means that a real and very important inner division has taken place in them, necessary for all further stages of the work. As it is exactly this passive side that has become separated from the active side, which can grow. The evolution of an individual in the work sense is an evolution from the passive, and not the active side of us. However, it is just because this inner division into an active and a passive side is so difficult to attain, and takes such a long time, attended by so many initial failures, that personal work halts, or moves in a complete circle. As this is such an important matter, and so difficult to grasp, let's put the same question in another context. Do you realize your mechanicalness, and do you continually realize it? What does it mean to realize one's mechanicalness? It means that you begin to realize that you are a machine that reacts to external influences. It does not act, but reacts. All that you have taken as individual and conscious action is actually mechanical. In other words, to realize what mechanicalness is to realize that you cannot behave differently from the way that you behave. Everyone of course thinks that they are free, and can act as they like or choose. Everyone thinks that he or she can say either this or that by choice, or do either this or that by choice. The work teaches that this is an illusion. It says that it is the first great illusion that must be dispelled in practical work on oneself. We cannot do, we can only be done to. In order to do, a person must be free to do so. In order to do, an individual must first be. And to be, someone must become a unity, not a dualism, as only then are they free. Such as we find ourselves, we are not free, although we so fondly imagine that we are. Whatever we do is dictated to us by our machine, by the kind of machine that has been built up in us through circumstances, education, imitation, peer pressure, culture, environment, era, epoch, fantasy, negative states, attitudes, opinions, and so on. This is one of the fundamental principles in the psychological teaching of this work. We cannot do. It does, in us, the machine does. This is what is meant by the saying that someone must reach the stage, through long and often painful inner observation, of realizing that there are two within them, one active and the other passive. The active persona does everything, by reacting to impressions. The passive, once it has come into conscious existence, can do nothing at first. It can only notice what the active does, and for a long time it must submit to this, however much the passive force is us would like things to be different. Becoming passive to oneself is the first stage of the work, and it requires great inner activity of attention. The question of control of personality arises later, and not at this stage. Before any question of control arises, a person must study what it means to become passive to themselves, what it means not to identify with themselves at every moment. Otherwise, they will always be identified with themselves. This includes the whole of themselves, everything they can observe in the process of time, not merely what they personally think is bad, but everything. That is why it is so often said that self-observation must be uncritical. If it is critical, then you will only observe one part, and never think of observing another part, which may actually be connected. The passive in us does not have the strength to change anything in the active, to control anything. Unfortunately, people start off right from the beginning, thinking they can control and trying to do so. This is impossible, unless the right point of control is established. The right point of control comes from the gradual strengthening of our passive inner self. It is often heard in this work that one is in prison. The first commentaries on this work were about prison, and about escape from prison. However, to escape, an individual must first realize that they are in prison, and see just where their prison lies. Gurdjieff taught that, if someone in prison is at any time to have a chance of escape, then they must first of all realize that they are in prison. If they imagine that they are free, then how can they even begin to think about escaping from prison? They will regard the idea as nonsense. As long as we fail to realize that we are in prison, we shall continue to believe that we are free. Then we have no chance whatsoever at freedom. No one can help us. No one can emancipate us by force, against our will, in opposition to our wishes. If liberation is possible, it is the first requisite that someone feels that they are deprived of their liberty, then begins the study of their incarceration, and through that, the means of escape. We can only gain freedom as the result of long work and effort, and by this is meant conscious effort, directed towards a definite aim. However, in order to escape from prison, one must have help. They must be told what to do, and told again and again, by those who have previously escaped, and who in turn can transmit their knowledge to others who have realized they are imprisoned, and have themselves begun to escape. In what is said, we must understand that no physical prison is meant, nor does it mean that the body is the prison. What is meant is a psychological prison that we must escape from. Everyone is in the prison of their own creation. If one could really stand alongside themselves, stand behind every aspect and every manifestation of themselves, whether they think it good or bad, then they would be able to see the prison they live in. But, in order to do so, they must first become passive to themselves. They must see all of their reactions, whether they regard them as good or bad, passively. This is what is meant by dispassion and discernment. They must see all the opinions they express, whether regarded as good or bad, with impartiality. We must see our attitudes. Once we have reached this stage, through long self-observation, then we are really divided into two individuals, one active and the other passive. The passive stands inside, or behind the active. The passive at this stage is powerless, but although they are powerless in the face of the active, they are now conscious of this, and see their impediment. This is the starting point of real change. So we can ask again the question considered: have you reached the stage of realizing that there is an active side in you that takes charge at every moment, and then a passive side that can only look on, which is quite helpless in the face of this active force? The less you identify with yourself, the more will you become dispassionate. If you have to pass from one room to another room, it will be impossible to do so if you are fastened to something in the first room. Suppose you are stuck to your armchair. It will be impossible to move, except with the armchair attached to you. And if the doorway is narrow, you will be unable to pass through it. You must imagine that we are fastened to many things that prevent us from passing to a new level of being. P.D. Ouspensky suggested imagining yourself wearing an enormous number of coats. He said that it was necessary to strip all of these coats off, one by one. Otherwise we would be too bulky to pass through a doorway. Any person who believes in themselves, in their virtue, their merit, and so on, is bulky in a psychological sense. So they cannot pass through the narrow gate, or through the eye of a needle. They are the proverbial camel, and a camel is a big and very obstinate creature. In the Gospels, a person who is very much identified with themselves is called a rich man. They have a firm idea of their own worth. They believe that they know, they are certain they can do, and are sure that right and wrong are clear to them. Such a person is very much identified with themselves. This is the rich man in the Gospels of whom Christ said it was easier for a camel to pass through the eye of a needle, than for a rich man to enter the kingdom of heaven. In the case given in the Gospels, the rich man felt he possessed goodness and had obtained much merit in everything he had done. He was identified with himself. So all that he did went into the wrong part of himself. Because of this, Christ said to him, "Go, sell all that thou hast." The rich man was sorry, for he had great possessions. He was identified with himself and his values. Yet he was not so much identified with himself as the Pharisee, who prayed, saying, "God, I thank thee, that I am not as the rest of men, extortioners, unjust, adulterers, or even as this publican. I fast twice in the week, I give tithes of all that I get," while the publican prayed, "God be merciful to me a sinner." The Pharisee is an extreme example of identification with oneself. Let's then clearly understand that someone may be very good in life, and do their duty, following all that they are taught faithfully, meeting danger with heroism and yet still be the rich man of the Gospels. This means that they are identified with themselves in all that they do, and are well satisfied with themselves. We've heard the phrase in the work which notes that until one reaches the stage of realizing their own nothingness, they cannot change. To begin to realize one's own nothingness as a practical experience is to begin to cease to be a rich man. In other words, it is to begin to cease identifying with yourself. We can then speak of identifying with oneself from different sides. And begin by saying that where we are identified with ourselves, there we cannot be passive or impartial to ourselves. To be identified with yourself means that you are fastened to something which you take as yourself. Suppose you are fastened to the idea that you are a truthful person. This means that you are fastened to this picture of yourself. You picture yourself, to yourself as always being truthful. So wherever you are, as it were, you take with you this picture. You have no existence apart from this picture. You are this picture, and it accompanies you everywhere, no matter if you are not even telling the truth. This makes little difference to the picture that you have of yourself, and to which you are firmly glued. If for a moment circumstances cause you to feel that you are not being quite truthful on some occasion, then at once you will begin to justify yourself, to explain and argue and so on until you feel once more quite comfortable inside, at peace with this picture which dominates you. This is being identified with yourself, and is an example belonging to the class of identifying with pictures of oneself. Of course, pictures are legion. Then everyone has special pictures of himself or herself, with which he or she identifies. One of the sources of our inner disharmony, and of our negative states lies in pictures. When a picture is, as it were, touched, we show our sensitivity, either by being depressed, or by being angry. In short, negative. When we carry a great many pictures about, we are very identified with ourselves. And the more we are identified with ourselves, the more liable we are to be upset, discouraged, disappointed, and so on. It is not only pictures that make a person liable to be upset. But pictures form a very definite source of instability in ourselves. Pictures are formed out of vanity and imagination, which means they belong to false personality, which is imaginary I. And with everything belonging to our false personality we are particularly identified. If we could really see through direct insight that we are not as we imagined, then the power of false personality would be weakened. On one side we would lose, however we'd actually gain far more than we would lose. But we always defend ourselves, even when we know better. This is because those two giants called pride and vanity will not allow us to yield, at least not to others. It is for this reason only that self-observation can help. You yourself, by seeing yourself, can yield to yourself. So a division must be made in oneself between the observing and the observed sides. Then at first, everything must be observed passively, and placed in the light of consciousness without criticism. If you have a picture of yourself as always being truthful, then you must observe over a long period just how often you lie. Only this inner realization will destroy the power of the picture with which you have been identified and to which you have been a slave. So long as we take ourselves as one person, we will never move from where we are. Yes, but why? Because we are then completely identified with ourselves. Our work only begins when we feel two individuals in ourselves. One is passive, which is the one who observes, the other is active, and this is the one who is observed. This active calls itself I. The passive is the beginning of the path to real I, but it is for a long time weak, and can do nothing. Then as the feeling of I is drawn out of the active, so does the passive become strengthened, until the time comes when the passive becomes active and the active is rendered passive. That is, a reversal takes place, and the inner controls the outer, not the outer the inner. Expanding on this further. As long as a person takes themselves as one, they cannot become different. They cannot change, because they are identified with themselves, and take everything in themselves as the self. Their thoughts, opinions, moods, feelings, sensations, and in fact, everything they take as I. They say I or me to them all. Recall what the work says about identifying. Identification is so common a quality, that for the purposes of observation it is difficult to separate it from everything else. We are always in a state of identification, and it is for this reason that we cannot remember ourselves. Identifying is one of our most terrible foes. It is necessary to see, and to study identifying to its very roots in oneself. Identifying is the chief obstacle to self-remembering. Someone who identifies with everything is unable to remember themselves. In order to remember oneself, it is necessary not to identify. But in order not to identify, one must first of all not be identified with themselves. We must remember that there are two in us, one that can only observe at first, and another that takes charge of us at every moment, and speaks in our name, calling itself I. We must try not to identify with this other persona who controls us, and become conscious of the fact that they are different from us, that there is another within. Unless this separation is made and continually made, we remain one, and nothing can change in us. The work teaches that the state of humankind is such that we identify with everything. For example, we identify with our knowledge. One person has one kind of knowledge, such as knowledge of the world, another has knowledge of science, a third knowledge of cooking, a fourth knowledge of business, a fifth knowledge of books and so on. But in each case a person will identify with his or her own knowledge. Notice how people having similar knowledge quarrel, and how in the so-called learned world, all sorts of extraordinary jealousies exist based on identifying. Doctors, for example, will always disagree as they are identified with their knowledge. Cooks also do not agree, nor do literary people, nor soldiers, nor parsons, nor mothers, and so on, and so on. You may even recall in childhood when you first began to identify with knowledge, and how pleased you felt when you were told something that others did not know, feeling a kind of power and superiority. Identifying gives a sense of power, because we are taught to believe that information is power. It was not of course the knowledge that we were interested in, but the fact that we could posture. Let's now take the subject of identifying with intellectual center. Here exist among other things attitudes, opinions, and thoughts. Do you know, or rather, have you observed that you identify with your opinions? This is another form of identifying with oneself. Of course an opinion is not you, but quite distinct. However, if we are identified, then the feeling of I becomes fastened to it. Perhaps you feel you do not have opinions. In any case, we all have thoughts. Can you say I to your thoughts? Or rather, do you say I to them invariably? Certainly, if you believe that everything in your inner world is I, then you cannot help doing so. But you might as well say that everything in the external world is yourself too. Often very depressing and complex thoughts come, then if one identifies with them they exert their full power. We are therefore identified with our thoughts. It is quite possible, however, not to identify with one's thoughts. In fact, it is necessary to learn to do this, and as soon as possible. Because it helps us a great deal in work on oneself, and in every way. It is impossible to stop thoughts. We can try this of course for a minute or two, but simply as an exercise in self-observation. One can however learn not to identify with thoughts, but this must begin first by observing them. Some thoughts are very interesting to observe. But tangled, complex and heavy thoughts are very dangerous to identify with. If we do not identify with something in ourselves, then we begin to become unfastened from its power.